It was the spring of 1943 when a strange convoy appeared off the American coast. Not tanks, not cargo, but men, thousands of them, wearing the grey-green of the Wehrmacht, the Iron Cross stitched over their hearts. They weren't invading, they were surrendering. From across the Atlantic, ships brought not only the spoils of war, but the very enemy itself. Captured in North Africa, from the deserts of Tunisia to the rocky passes of Kasserine, these German soldiers had once fought under Rommel's command, the fabled Afrika Korps. Now they were bound for an unimaginable destination, the United States of America. For many of them, this journey was filled with fear. Rumors had spread through the ranks before capture that Americans would kill their prisoners, that they'd be starved, tortured, or forced into endless labor. But what awaited them on the other side of the Atlantic was something no German soldier could have predicted. The voyage took weeks. Inside the cramped holds, soldiers wrote notes home, unsure if they'd ever be delivered. One diary entry, later found in a POW camp archive, read, "We are told we stir going to America. America, I cannot imagine it. We are the enemy, yet they treat us like men. They even gave us bread with butter." When the ships finally neared the shores of New York, a stunned silence fell across the decks. For many of the prisoners, it was their first sight of the Statue of Liberty, towering above the harbor, gleaming in the afternoon sun. Some stared in disbelief. Others laughed nervously. A few quietly wept. One American guard remembered later. They looked like ghosts. Some crossed themselves when they saw the statue. Maybe they realized the war wasn't set the whole world after all. From that moment, the prisoners of Hitler's army stepped onto American soil, into a land untouched by war. They didn't yet know they would soon live among quiet farmlands, sleep in clean barracks, and eat food that many back home could only dream of. They didn't yet know they were about to experience one of the most paradoxical chapters in military history, where enemies were treated with decency, and freedom was glimpsed not on the battlefield, but behind barbed wire. But how did thousands of German soldiers end up in the heart of America? And what did they discover there that would change their understanding of everything they'd been taught? Before the quiet fields of America, there was the roar of the desert. Before the white fences and farmlands, there was dust, heat, and defeat. The story of the German POWs in America begins not in the West, but under the blistering North African sun. In 1942, the Afrika Korps, commanded by the brilliant Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had pushed the British to the edge of disaster. His armored columns sliced across Libya and Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal, the lifeline of the British Empire. For months, the Allies feared that if Rommel broke through, the Middle East might fall. But by late 1942, the tide began to turn. Supplies ran thin, fuel was scarce, and the Americans, newly arrived in the war, landed in Morocco and Algeria under Operation Torch. Trapped between two advancing armies, the British from the east and the Americans from the west, Rommel's once feared forces began to crumble. At Tunis, in May 1943, over 250,000 Axis soldiers laid down their arms. It was the largest mass surrender of German troops since Stalingrad. And among them were tens of thousands of men who had no idea where they would be sent next. The Allies faced a logistical nightmare. Where do you house 250,000 prisoners? North Africa was unstable, Britain was bombed and overcrowded, and Europe was still a battlefield. Then came an idea, bold and practical. Send them to America. The United States, vast and secure, had both the space and the resources. The journey would be long, across a U-boat-infested ocean, but safer than keeping them near the front. And so, in secret and in silence, convoys began to cross the Atlantic. Each ship carried hundreds of captured German soldiers, officers, engineers, medics, and farm boys barely out of their teens, bound for a country they'd only known through propaganda posters. For the Americans, it was a surreal reversal. Only 2 years earlier, these men had been the face of the enemy, disciplined, ruthless, unstoppable. Now they were prisoners, disarmed and weary. But America treated them not as monsters, but as men, a decision rooted not in mercy, but in strategy. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, the US was obligated to provide humane treatment to all POWs. It was a moral choice and a political message that democracy, even in war, had a conscience. Every meal, every medical check, every respectful word spoken to a German prisoner was meant to show the world, and the enemy, the difference between tyranny and freedom. One American officer later said, "If we treated them like animals, we'd be no better than the regime they fought for." By mid-1943, the first ships reached American ports. The German prisoners, once part of Hitler's proud army, now stepped onto docks patrolled by soldiers from Iowa, Texas, and New York, young men who'd grown up hearing only of their cruelty. And yet, what happened next was not hatred. It was curiosity. As the trains rolled inland past vast fields and quiet towns, the prisoners saw something that challenged everything they'd been told: a land of abundance, untouched by war, where even the farmers had cars and electricity. They began to wonder, had they been fighting for the wrong side all along? Their journey across America was just beginning. Ahead lay the barbed wire of the POW camps, and a reality that would test their beliefs more deeply than the desert ever had. When the long trains carrying German prisoners finally stopped, it wasn't in a fortress or a prison yard. It was in places with names like Camp Swift, Texas, Camp Algona, Iowa, Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Quiet towns surrounded by farmland, where life moved slowly and the sky stretched endlessly. For the German soldiers stepping off those trains, it was as if they had arrived on another planet. One prisoner wrote later, "We expected hatred. We found curiosity. People looked at us not with anger, but with wonder, as if they couldn't believe the enemy looked so ordinary." The camps were ringed with barbed wire and guarded by young American soldiers, some barely older than the prisoners themselves. Inside, barracks stood in neat rows with wooden bunks, dining halls, and even libraries. By the rules of the Geneva Convention, every prisoner was entitled to food, clothing, and medical care equivalent to that of US troops. And so the Germans found themselves eating better than many civilians in war-torn Europe. Eggs, bacon, milk, luxuries they hadn't seen in years. At first, they couldn't believe it was real. Was this generosity a trap, a way to soften them before interrogation? But day after day the kindness continued. One American guard, Private Tom Jenkins, recalled, "They were polite, disciplined. Some even saluted us. We ended up talking about baseball and farming. Hard to hate a man when he sits telling you about his home back in Bavaria." And for many of the German POWs, the shock wasn't just in the comfort of their surroundings. It was in what they didn't see. No bombed-out cities. No starving civilians. No propaganda posters on every wall. Instead, peaceful towns, movie theaters, children playing in the streets. To men who had been told that America was a land of chaos, greed, and racial decay, the sight of ordinary families living free, unafraid, shattered decades of indoctrination. One former German officer, Karl-Heinz Tupfer, wrote years later, "In Germany, we believed the Americans were barbarians. In America, I learned they were human beings, and I began to wonder if we had been the barbarians." Soon the prisoners began working, harvesting crops, building fences, cutting timber, part of a vast wartime labor program. Their labor helped keep American agriculture alive while millions of US men fought overseas. They were paid in canteen coupons, could buy cigarettes or soap, even send money back to Germany through Red Cross channels. And in small, quiet moments, unexpected friendships formed. An Iowa farmer, Sip's wife, remembered. "One of them fixed our windmill after a storm. He didn't have to. He just wanted to help. When he left, I baked him a pie. It felt strange. The enemy sitting at our table, but somehow it felt right." Behind the fences, humanity persisted. Men who had once saluted Hitler now tended American fields. They sang songs at night, carved wooden toys for local children, and watched sunsets over a land that felt impossibly peaceful. But not all were changed so easily. Some clung fiercely to Nazi ideology, refusing to speak to guards or fellow prisoners who doubted the Reich. And soon that internal division between loyalty and awakening would spark tension within the camps themselves. The war for their souls was far from over. Inside the barbed wire, a different kind of battle was about to begin, one fought not with bullets but with conscience. By 1944, more than 400,000 German prisoners of war were scattered across the United States, from the deserts of Arizona to the pine forests of Maine. Most had settled into routine work, meals, letters home, the quiet rhythm of survival. But beneath the calm, another war had begun. A war of belief and betrayal. Inside the camps, the German prisoners split into two worlds. On one side were the National Socialists, men who still worshipped Hitler, who believed defeat was temporary, that the Führer would somehow return. On the other were the realists, soldiers who had seen enough blood and ruin to know the truth. The Reich was collapsing. The tension simmered like a hidden fire. One American interpreter, Lieutenant Robert Lutz, wrote in his journal, "You could tell them apart by the eyes. The fanatics stared right through you, proud, unbending. The others looked tired, as if the war still lived inside them." The Nazis organized themselves in secret, a Kameradschaftsbund, or Comrades' League, enforcing loyalty through intimidation. They held clandestine meetings, whispered propaganda, and punished any man who spoke ill of Hitler or admitted doubt. To them, surrender was shame, and shame had to be purged. One night in 1944, at Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, that hidden war turned deadly. A young prisoner named Johannes Kunze, just 25 years old, was accused by fellow Germans of being a traitor, of helping American guards, and worse, of criticizing the Führer. The camp guards found him the next morning, beaten to death by his own countrymen. The murder shocked the camp and sent a chill through the entire POW system. Kunze's death revealed the fear that still ruled these men. Even behind American fences, Hitler's shadow reached across the ocean. The US Army quickly cracked down, isolating known extremists, transferring them to higher security camps, and separating them from moderate prisoners. But the damage was done. Inside the wire, trust was gone. For many prisoners, this was the turning point. They began to see the ideology they'd followed for what it was, not honor, not patriotism, but fear and control. Some started reading American newspapers distributed in camp, watching war newsreels, seeing the devastation of Germany for the first time. Others attended English classes, debated politics, even discussed democracy. And slowly, a quiet transformation began. One camp officer described it. They arrived as soldiers of Hitler, but they are leaving as men who question him. Yet for all the ideological battles within, there was another tension pressing from without, the realization that while they lived safely behind American fences, their families back home were starving under Allied bombs. Letters arrived, fragile with grief and censorship. Some men refused to open them, afraid of what they might find. Others wept in silence. They had survived capture, the voyage, and their own comrades, but nothing tested their hearts more than the knowledge that home was dying without them. Still, the Americans pressed forward with a bold idea, to not only contain the enemy, but to re-educate him. It would be one of the most audacious psychological efforts of the war, and it would change the fate of many German prisoners forever. From behind barbed wire, the battle for minds was about to begin. By 1944, the war in Europe was reaching its most brutal crescendo. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The Eastern Front was collapsing. And in the heart of America, thousands of German prisoners, once proud soldiers of Hitler, now waited helplessly, listening for news that could destroy what remained of their world. For many, hope began to unravel. Letters from home arrived less often, and when they did, they carried unbearable weight. "Our house is gone," wrote one prisoner's wife from Hamburg. "Your brother is missing. The children are cold. They say the war will end soon, but we don't know how we will survive it." The men behind the wire faced a torment few could imagine. They were alive, well-fed, safe, while their families starved under falling bombs. The guilt gnawed at them like hunger. Some stopped eating. Others begged to be returned to Europe, even to captivity there, just to be closer to home. For the first time, the American guards saw the pride of the Wehrmacht crumble into something far more human: despair. One camp psychologist later recalled, "They stopped speaking of victory. They spoke of survival, of shame, of wondering if they had been fighting for a lie." Yet within that sorrow, new conflicts burned. The Nazi diehards, cornered by reality, grew more desperate to keep control of their comrades. They spread rumors that Germany was developing new miracle weapons, that Hitler had escaped death, that the Allies would soon destroy each other. But their voices sounded hollow, even to themselves. The war of loyalty became a war of survival. Prisoners who renounced Nazism risked violence from their peers. Guards had to intervene in midnight brawls. Camp authorities began separating fanatics from the rest. Entire barracks relocated, fences built within fences. The psychological toll was enormous. Some prisoners collapsed into silence. Others, in quiet corners of the camp, began writing letters to American chaplains, asking questions they'd never dared ask before. About morality, about guilt, about God. At Camp Ruston, Louisiana, a Lutheran chaplain named Reverend Paul Schmidt started holding voluntary Bible discussions. At first, only a handful of prisoners attended. By the winter of 1944, hundreds came, not just to pray, but to think. They debated what it meant to follow orders, and what it meant to be responsible for evil. One man stood up and said, "We obeyed, we did not think, and now we see what that obedience has done." Silence followed. For many, it was the first honest reckoning of their lives. While Europe burned, a quiet awakening was beginning behind the wire. Not in all, but in enough to matter. They began to understand that survival was not just about living, but about living with truth. Still, for every soul finding light, another was breaking under the darkness. As Germany's cities fell one by one, the sense of finality crushed those who had once believed themselves part of an invincible Reich. When word reached the camps of Hitler's death in April 1945, reactions were divided. Some wept openly. Others stood in stunned silence. And a few smiled faintly, as if a heavy weight had finally lifted. The war was ending. But for these men, the question of who they had been and who they might become was just beginning. The war in Europe had ended. The guns had fallen silent. But in hundreds of POW camps scattered across America, a quieter revolution was just beginning. It wasn't fought with rifles or tanks, but with ideas. In the summer of 1945, the German prisoners learned the final truth. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. Germany, the Reich they had sworn to defend, no longer existed. At first, disbelief. Then, silence. And finally, something rare in war: reflection. One prisoner wrote in his journal, "For years we were told we were the masters of the world. Now we are powerless, standing in the fields of our enemy, and they treat us better than we ever treated others. What does that say about us?" As the shock settled, the US military seized an opportunity to help these men see a different kind of Germany, one that might rise from the ashes, not in hate, but in understanding. It began with what they called the Intellectual Diversion Program. At first glance, it seemed simple: books, lectures, and films shown inside the camps. But its purpose was profound: to re-educate the enemy. They screened films about democracy, about justice, about life in America. Not propaganda, but stories of ordinary citizens, of civic duty, of freedom under law. At first, the prisoners mocked them. But slowly, curiosity replaced cynicism. After all, they were living proof of the system's decency. English classes filled quickly. POWs devoured American newspapers discussing news of Reconstruction and politics. Some even started their own camp newspapers, printing essays about rebuilding Germany on moral, not military ground. One camp in Nebraska established a miniature democracy. Prisoners elected camp representatives, proposed rules, and even held debates. For men raised under dictatorship, it was their first taste of self-governance. and the change ran deeper than anyone expected. An American instructor remembered a young prisoner, a former Hitler youth, who approached him after class. He said quietly, "I was told you Americans had no soul, but you set given me books, food, and freedom to speak. Maybe we were the ones without a soul." Moments like these were not just symbolic, they were transformative. For many of the POWs, work became another path toward healing. They labored on American farms, built roads, repaired fences. They were paid modestly, but they earned something greater: trust. Farmers began to see them not as enemies, but as helping hands. In some towns, locals invited them to church services or Sunday dinners, guarded still but kind. And the prisoners, in turn, began to see Americans not as monsters but as neighbors. One guard later said, "The strangest thing was watching them smile. You could tell something inside them had changed, like the war had been exorcised from their hearts." It was here, not on the battlefield, not in surrender, that Germany's future began to change shape. Not all would reform, not all could. But in the calm of an American camp, among strangers who treated them with dignity, thousands of German prisoners discovered something their homeland had forgotten: that strength without humanity means nothing. Soon the journey home would begin. And with it, a question: after living in the land of their enemy, how would they face the ruins of their own? By late 1945, the war was over, but its prisoners remained. Across America, hundreds of camps still held more than 370,000 German POWs. They had missed the end of the Reich, the fall of Berlin, the Nuremberg trials beginning to expose the full horror of what their nation had done. And now, the United States faced a question unlike any other. What do you do with an enemy who no longer exists? The US Army's answer was deliberate, disciplined, and deeply humane. They called it Operation Repatriation. Step by step, camp by camp, men who had once fought under the swastika were processed for return to Europe. Medical checks, debriefings, new clothing, Red Cross records, all organized with military precision. Each prisoner was asked a series of questions. Where were you captured? Do you still support National Socialism? What will you do when you go home? For many, those final questions cut deeper than any interrogation, because going home meant confronting both the ruins of their cities and the ruins of their conscience. The strategy went far beyond logistics. It was psychological, even moral. The US intended not just to send these men home, but to send them home changed. The War Department partnered with universities, clergy, and educators to prepare them. They held farewell lectures on democracy and individual responsibility. They screened films of Germany's destruction and of the concentration camps, so the prisoners could not claim ignorance of what their nation had done. One American major described the moment vividly. They watched in silence. When the film ended, no one spoke. One man simply asked if he could kneel and pray. It was the first time many of them faced the truth that their obedience had helped build a machine of death. And though some refused to believe, others were visibly broken. In that silence, the re-education effort found its greatest victory, not in words, but in realization. Then came the departures. By rail to the coasts, then by ship across the Atlantic, the same route they had once taken as captives, but now as witnesses. Witnesses to a strange and impossible mercy. In the holds of those ships, the conversations were different this time. Not about victory or defeat, but about what they had seen. About America. About humanity. About the possibility of a Germany rebuilt on moral ground, not conquest. They spoke of the guards who had treated them with respect, of the farmers who had shared food with them, of American children who waved from across the fences. And many wrote vows in their journals, silent promises to never again raise a hand in hatred. One note, later found in a Red Cross archive, read simply, "I left Germany a soldier, I return a man." For America, the treatment of its prisoners had been more than compassion. It was strategy. It proved that democracy could fight tyranny not only with force but with moral strength. And for the prisoners, that lesson became indelible. When they stepped onto the shattered soil of post-war Germany, Many carried with them a piece of what they had seen in the land of their enemy: fairness, honesty, and freedom of thought. But what awaited them at home would test that transformation. They returned to ruins, cities of ashes, families broken, and a people haunted by guilt. And in that devastation, the seeds planted behind barbed wire in America would either wither or take root. It was winter when the ships began to reach the European coast, fog curling over the grey Atlantic, the air thick with salt and uncertainty. For thousands of German prisoners, the long journey west was over. But what waited for them was not the Germany they had left behind. As they disembarked, silence hung in the air. The first sight that met them was not banners or soldiers, but rubble. City after city, Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, reduced to skeletons of brick and ash. The proud Reich they had once served had vanished, leaving behind a haunted silence. For years, they had imagined home. Now home looked like a graveyard. One POW, Heinrich Müller, wrote in his diary, "I had pictured my village as it was. Instead, there was only a street of ghosts. My mother Sip's house was gone. Even the church tower leaned like an old man. America had been the enemy. But this felt like judgment." The returning men faced suspicion from their own people. Many Germans saw them as the lucky ones, fed, sheltered, even educated while their families starved. Some whispered, "You lived like kings in America." Others couldn't understand how these former soldiers spoke of fairness and democracy instead of vengeance. Yet within these returning men, something had shifted. They had witnessed another way of life, one built not on fear, but on freedom. They had worked in American fields, eaten at American tables, seen churches where faith was not propaganda, and watched towns where dissent wasn't punished. In the quiet of their captivity, they had seen what strength without cruelty could look like. One former POW later recalled, "In the camps I learned what freedom meant, not slogans but the right to speak and think without fear." And as they picked up shovels instead of rifles, these men began quietly rebuilding their country. Some became teachers. Some, farmers again. Some even joined the fledgling movement that would become the Federal Republic of Germany, teaching younger generations that honor could exist without hatred. They were not heroes in the traditional sense, not soldiers who had won a war, but men who had survived it and learned from it. Their captivity had become their education. Their defeat had become their awakening. One American general, reflecting years later, said, "We didn't just capture an army, we captured an idea and replaced it with a better one." By the 1950s, many of those former POWs were helping build the foundation of a democratic West Germany. They became part of the new Bundeswehr, the civil service, the schools, and the factories that rose from the ruins. Their memories of fair treatment in American camps lingered, a quiet moral compass guiding them away from the darkness that had once consumed their nation. For them, America had not been a place of humiliation, but of transformation. They had arrived as enemies. They left as witnesses to the power of humanity in victory. And the Germany they rebuilt was forever shaped by what they had seen behind barbed wire under the watchful eyes of their former foes. But not all could bear the weight of what they'd learned. Some returned home only to find guilt unbearable, memories unspoken. For them, the war never truly ended. And yet, their silence too carried meaning, a warning to the generations that would follow. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world began to rebuild, brick by brick, heart by heart. But not all rebuilding could be seen. Some of it lived quietly inside the men who had once been called the enemy. For most of the German prisoners who had seen America, life after captivity was not simple. They returned to cities in ruins, families scattered, and a country divided between East and West. Many struggled to find work or a sense of purpose in a nation wrestling with guilt and hunger. And yet, beneath the hardship, something enduring had taken root. They carried with them a new understanding that strength was not found in domination, but in freedom, that respect could endure even between enemies. The small acts of humanity they had experienced in America became their compass. One former POW, Karl-Heinz Luders, later wrote, The first man who treated me like a human being was my American guard. He didn't know it, but that day he began rebuilding Germany. Across Germany, those returned men became quiet ambassadors of a different mindset. In schools, in workshops, in community halls, they spoke softly of what they had learned, about honesty, fairness, and the absurdity of hate. They rarely used the word democracy. Instead, they described it in actions, in how they treated their neighbors, their workers, their children. Historians now call this the human bridge, an invisible network of former POWs who helped rebuild moral trust between America and Germany. When US aid arrived through the Marshall Plan, these men were often the first to step forward to cooperate, to translate, to organize. They knew the Americans not as occupiers, but as people. And in the quiet years that followed, the letters began. Thousands of former POWs wrote back to their American hosts, to farmers in Iowa, to families in Texas, to guards in Georgia. Some sent photographs of their children. Others sent thanks written in careful English. "You taught me that an enemy could have a heart. I have never forgotten." Out of those letters grew friendships that lasted decades. By the 1960s, American families who had once watched German prisoners through fences were visiting them in their rebuilt homes along the Rhine and the Danube. Enemies had become correspondents. Correspondents became friends. And friends became living proof that humanity could outlast war. This was the quiet transformation, the part of history that never made the headlines. No parades, no medals, no speeches. Just men who had seen the worst of humanity, choosing in small, ordinary ways to be better than what the war had made them. Even decades later, some POWs still spoke of the moment they first saw America, not as a battlefield, but as a glimpse of possibility. One said simply, "I arrived in chains. I left with an idea that mercy is stronger than power." That idea became part of post-war Germany's soul. And though few noticed, the treatment of those prisoners became one of America's greatest victories, not of weapons, but of conscience. In the story of the German POWs, the United States proved that moral strength can reshape even a defeated enemy into a future ally. Their story reminds us that every war ends twice, once on the battlefield and once in the human heart. And it's the second ending that truly decides whether peace will last. They came as enemies. They left as men changed by mercy. And history, in all its fury and fire, quietly recorded one of its most extraordinary experiments in humanity. When the first German POWs stepped onto American soil in 1943, few could have imagined what would follow. The war still raged, and hatred was easy to find. But instead of vengeance, America chose principle. Instead of cruelty, it chose restraint. And that choice, unseen by most, became one of the most powerful acts of moral leadership in the entire war. Within those fences, the United States proved something the world had almost forgotten, that even in total war, humanity need not be surrendered. Those camps became classrooms of conscience, where both sides learned that dignity was not weakness, and decency was not defeat. To the American guards who treated their captives as men, not monsters. To the farmers who shared bread with those who had once sought to destroy them. To the POWs who carried those lessons home and built a freer Germany. Their legacy endures. Today, when nations speak of reconstruction, rehabilitation, and reconciliation, they echo a lesson first written in the soil of Texas, Oklahoma, and Minnesota, where enemies discovered their shared humanity behind barbed wire. It reminds us that war's greatest test is not how fiercely we fight, but how deeply we remember our humanity in the midst of it. Because it is mercy, not might, that shapes the peace to come. Those who lived through that time are fading now, the guards, the prisoners, the farmers, the families. But their story remains a quiet monument to something rare, the victory of compassion over hatred, the triumph of conscience over conquest. As we reflect on this story, we are reminded that the fences we build in war can sometimes become bridges in peace. But the truest strength of a nation is not only in the power of its armies, but in the generosity of its heart. Because history doesn't just live in books or battlefields. It lives in the choices we make when no one is watching.